Hey guys, we're talking about voting today, and we mentioned other forms of political participation in government, but we said the one thing that most people will actually do is get out to vote. Now, getting out to vote, we think it's pretty easy, and generally it is, but a lot of people don't even do it. And one of the precursors to voting is voter registration. Up until the 1990s, voter registration typically had to be done at your local county courthouse. So when you were of age to go and vote, you simply go to the county courthouse, you fill out the paperwork necessary, and there you go. You're registered to vote. But people saw this as kind of an obstacle, particularly in years where transportation wasn't exactly as easy as it is now. And think about this for a second, too. If you live, say, out on Barker's Ridge, and you had to drive to the Cabell County Courthouse just to register to vote, well, that's a long trip. And a lot of people simply didn't see it as worthwhile, or they just forgot, or some other reason came up. And so voter registration can sometimes be a hindrance in terms of getting that accomplished. And it's almost like, why plan a special trip to the courthouse when that's a long haul? So inevitably the US government said, let's make it easier for people to register to vote. So the United States Congress passed something called the National Voter Registration Act. All right. It's also known as the Motor Voter Law. I swear I'm not making that name up. All right. And what this allowed people to do is it allowed you to register to vote when you're at the DMV. When you're getting your driver's license for the first time, or your adult license, that is, when you're 18, or when you're getting your license renewed, you have the option to register to vote. It's really simple. All you have to do is check a little box on the form, fill out which party you want to register as, and there you go. You're registered to vote. And people are like, "Hey, you gotta go to the DMV to get your driver's license renewed." So this is like you killed two birds with one stone, right? And what do you think happened to voter registration numbers when they passed this law? And the answer is they went up markedly. Making voter registration easier inevitably increased voter registration. Who knew? You're going to find out too that a lot of other nations do things differently than us. We require people to register to vote on of their own free will, but there are many countries who have automatic voter registration. And one of the things that is gaining some momentum here in the United States, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea, is automatic voter registration with an opt out. Now, an opt out means you're automatically registered to vote, but of course, you can choose to have your name pulled from voter registration. And why would we do such a thing? And why do people just say, "Hey, why if I had to go downtown to Huntington from Barker's Ridge, uh, maybe that I can make a big trip of it. I can run some errands that I'm going to have to do anyway, and get registered to vote in the process." And the answer is this: what's tied to voter registration that a lot of people don't want to do? And maybe you haven't contemplated this yet because you're not necessarily old enough, but jury duty is absolutely connected to voter registration. That's how they pull information to see who's going to go on jury duty. And a lot of people use that as a reason why they don't register to vote. Now, voter registration, there's also some weird quirks that go state by state as to what people do in terms of voter registration. And some states allow what's called same day voter registration. We don't allow that here in the good state of West Virginia, but there are some states that will permit you to register to vote on the same day as the election. And if you look at page 432, they have a little graph showing you which states allow that. There's only 16 states in the country that currently allow same day voter registration. The closest ones to us, in fact, Ohio and Maryland allow you to do it, but most states aren't okay with that. And the rationale to why is largely it's debatable, but some people think it's kind of a hindrance. We should allow same day voter registration with the technology that we have. A lot of people think that maybe that invites the possibility for fraud, but that's another story for another day. So we have voter registration. That's an issue. You can go to your county courthouse. You can now do it by the DMV. West Virginia has made it a lot easier in a lot of in other capacities with the advent of technology. You can now register to vote on the internet. You can do mail-in forms. West Virginia, in particular, makes it very easy to register to vote. Now, despite the fact that voter registration is incredibly easy, and really it wasn't that difficult in years past, voter discrimination has been a real issue in the United States. And if you aren't aware, voter discrimination has been aimed primarily at minorities, particularly racial minorities and black citizens. Now, post-Civil War South is not exactly a place that is, uh, what you call an opportunity for equality. At least not what we would think of as equality. But in particular, one of the more sinister forms of oppression that Southern states implemented was that of voter discrimination. That way, black people who outnumbered white people in many southern states simply could not vote for leaders that would represent their interests and look more like them. And several forms of voter discrimination took place. For example, poll taxes. Literally, states would say in order to vote, you had to have paid a certain tax, right? And that was not, we didn't rid ourselves of that. Literally, it took a constitutional amendment. And so, what Southern states would do is they're like, hey, we know we're not allowed to discriminate in terms of the right to vote based on race or previous condition of servitude. That was right after the Civil War. So they're like, hey, we can't discriminate against black people in terms of voting rights. So they said, you know what? What's a more clever way to discriminate against black people? And they said one of those was poll taxes. And they could legitimately say, hey, we are not discriminating against people because they're black. We're discriminating against them because they haven't paid a particular tax. Well, first of all, take a guess who were the poorest people in society, especially in post Civil War South? The black people. And beyond that, the poll tax wasn't really applied equitably to all races. This is aimed primarily at keeping black people from voting, or in some instances, keeping poor whites from voting who had the same economic interests as black people. So, voter discrimination form number one here, the poll tax. Voter discrimination form number two, the grandfather clause. This one didn't last quite as long, but is still pretty jacked up in a way. The grandfather clause, after the Civil War, states would say, you're only eligible to vote if your grandfather was eligible to vote. And ultimately, they're not basing it on race. They're saying, hey, this applies to white people. Well, white people had grandparents who were eligible to vote. But if you were black in the post Civil War South, your grandfather was probably a slave and didn't have the right to vote. So ultimately, this creates a bit of a problem. Ah, God, Southerners are such jerks. Right. Third major form of voter discrimination, and this one is bizarre in its own way, the literacy test. In the South, states would set up individualized little tests for black people to take, and they said, hey, we're not discriminating against people who are black, we're discriminating against people who are uneducated and probably not really in a good place to make a decision. And what one of the things that Southern states tried to do in particular was change the narrative about what was going on in the South. They said, look, we're not trying to discriminate against black people. We just don't want uneducated people getting to vote and voting in uneducated office holders to represent interests that would harm the state as a whole, right? And that's really a fancy way of saying we don't want black people in. Now, let me show you something in particular with our literacy test. Every state was different. Okay, every state came up with their own literacy test that was a bit different. And in Louisiana, this one is an entertaining one. Notice that it says this test will be given to anyone who cannot prove a fifth grade education. So they're like, hey, you have to be educated at least to the fifth grade level, or you have to take this test. And it says, do what you're told in each statement, nothing more, nothing less. One Wrong answer denotes failure of the test, and you have 10 minutes to complete. Right? And look at this, it cracks me up. Draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. Well, does it mean the word number or letter or a letter or the number? Who knows? Uh, Cross out the longest word in this line. Circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. Oh, interesting. Above the letter X, make a small cross. First of all, if you haven't noticed, does this really affect a person or denote intelligence or literacy? And the answer to that is absolutely not. But if you keep looking at all these questions, they're designed in many ways to either cause you to stop and think for a long time, and you only have 10 minutes, or in some of them, they want you to like literally have an answer that could be construed as incorrect either way. Like, for example, it says, spell backwards forwards. Are they wanting you to spell the word backwards forwards, which would be as it is, or are they wanting you to spell the word forwards backwards? No matter what you wrote down, the answer was going to be wrong. They wanted a good reason to be able to say, no, you're not literate. And if you look at this one, draw a figure that is a square in shape. Divide it by half by drawing a straight line from its northeast corner to its southwest corner. What is this? Geometry slash geography? It's ridiculous. Now look at 25 really fast too. Print what you read in the triangle below, and really quickly say it out loud to yourself. And if you said Paris in the spring, you'd be wrong. Look at it again. Now, you look at all of these, and like the last one, this is annoying, and I swear some of you might will try to do this. Draw 5 circles that have, or they didn't even spell it correctly on here. One common interlocking part, right? And all of these, look at 28. Divide a vertical line in 2 equal parts by bisecting it with a curved horizontal line that is only straight at its spot of bisection. Is this a Trina Wise question? This is ridiculous. Right from left to right as you see it spelled here. And if you want to try taking this, you can put in the literacy test of Louisiana and you can see specifically what has happened or how quickly you'll screw that up. Now, let's put in Alabama literacy test. Some of them, and this right here, you can see that Alabama tried to play a little more straight. They would ask you a series of questions about government and your rights, etc. So, they could try to at least say with a straight face that they're just trying to measure your knowledge about being a good citizen. And strangely enough, this one's not really a bad test in terms of just measuring knowledge. But they've got 68 questions here. And I think on Alabama's, you could miss like something like 4 or 5 before you were counted as failing. All right. But all of these, for example, the federal census population takes place every 10 years, true, or every 5 years, true or false. And obviously that's false. It's every 10 years. The person's indicted for a crime, 2 rights they have. And you've got this test, and they want to make it long and hard. It's like the citizenship test in a way. But here's what they forget about this. The United States Constitution doesn't allow for barriers like this to exist. The U.S. Constitution, with the 15th Amendment, specifically is talking about that you can't discriminate on the basis of race, and Southerners would argue that we're not discriminating on race, but at its core, it's an indirect attempt at it. Either way, to change voter discrimination and uh, to get rid of grandfather clauses and literacy tests, especially those literacy tests, the United States government had to pass what's called the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And please, I almost guarantee you it'll be on the AP exam. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 does several things, but notably it banned literacy tests and grandfather clauses to help prevent this. Now, every year, usually there's at least one student that'll pick up on this, but the 1965 Voting Rights Act does not ban poll taxes. Okay, it took a constitutional amendment to do that. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 bans literacy tests and grandfather clauses. But the 24th Amendment to the Constitution had to ban poll taxes. And if you're wondering why that one needed a constitutional amendment, whereas grandfather clauses and literacy tests just needed a simple law passed by Congress, here's the difference. Remember, states still have a right to tax their citizens. And so to prevent that from happening, you'd had to actually put it in the Constitution. Now, voter discrimination, in terms of what we see today, all right, there's still arguably a form of voter discrimination that people are uncomfortable with. And if you haven't guessed it, it's voter ID laws. Many states have enacted laws that require that you show a photo ID when you're voting. And the reason or the rationale for this, for the states that have enacted it, is that they want to make sure that when you go to vote, it's really you. Because you would be really frustrated if you showed up to vote and somebody had specifically already voted giving your name. And to give you an idea, up until I would say 2018, I think, I had never been asked to see a photo ID to vote. And when I would go and vote, I would just say, "Here's my name, here's where," and they would look at a little book and they say, "Is your address still at this location?" And I would be like, "Yep." And they would have me sign for it, and then I would go and vote. And so people say, "Look, this prevents voter fraud. It's a good law." Right? So what's the argument against that? And the argument is this, that uh, in order to get a photo ID of some kind, whether it be a driver's license or like a passport or some form of photo identification, you have to pay money for that. And what do you think that people who object to a photo ID law, they would say, "Hey, this is just another form of a poll tax." Right? That you have to pay money in order to vote. Now, some people would argue, like, yeah, but everybody gets a driver's license, and that's not true. Not everybody does get a driver's license, especially if you live in a major urban area. A lot of people there don't see a driver's license is really that big a deal because public transportation's a thing. So you have to go out and spend money to get a photo ID in order to go and vote, and people don't like that. In fact, not only do they not like it, they're like, hey, even if it was just $1, it would still be a poll tax of a form. You still have to pay money to go and vote. And so people are very frustrated with this. And in many instances, they see it as aimed at preventing minorities from voting because the poorest people in American society are Black, Mexican, or Hispanic people, and generally any person of color. And so they're saying, hey, what you're trying to do is prevent these people from voting. Now, if you don't believe me in terms of the people of color being the at most economically disadvantaged, simply look at the numbers. The average wealth of an American white family, and we say wealth, we're talking about the amount of value that your stuff has. If you sold everything, if you sold all your stuff and took away all your debt, what would the value be? And the average white family has a wealth of about $100,000. The average Black family in this country has average wealth of about somewhere between $6,000 to $8,000. White families generally have about 15 to 20 times more wealth than Black families. And that's not talking about income, we're talking about wealth. Now, there are reasons for that, but traditionally, one of the reasons why is that Black people had laws preventing them from accumulating wealth over time, and they were traditionally denied education. So they haven't had necessarily a chance to build wealth over time and pass it down from one generation to the next. Now, where we're going with that is simply to say that people are often uncomfortable with voter ID laws. Now, let's talk about voter turnout. Voter turnout also depends on the type of election. And as you've seen this year, presidential elections always have the highest voter turnout, right? Our presidential elections were the ones where we have the most turnout: 2020, 2016, 2012, 2008, and in 4 years in 2024, we're going to have a pretty good voter turnout. Usually, in a presidential year, you get 55 to 60% voter turnout. Because this election was such a hotly contested election, the numbers estimate now that you're going to get about 67 or 68% voter turnout in the United States, which is really high for this country. Okay. So, presidential year, and remember, presidential year, you not only had the president on the line, but you've got all 435 House seats. You've got a third of the senators up for election. And of course, there's a lot of state and local races too. So, that's a big deal. Now, presidential years have the highest voter turnout. However, we also have to consider midterm elections. Midterm elections are the ones that happen between presidential years, literally in the middle of a president's term. In 2022, we'll have a midterm election where all 435 House members will be up for reelection because remember, they only get 2-year terms. And then you'll have another third of the senators up for reelection. Of course, there's no presidential candidacy on the ballot. Now, the only thing that's missing from a presidential year to a midterm year is the president. And take a guess what happens to voter turnout in a midterm election. The numbers go down markedly. Normally, in a midterm election, you're lucky to get 35 to 40% voter turnout. Control of Congress is on the line, but people don't come out to vote as much. And why is that? And the answer is they don't perceive it to be as important because the president's not on the ballot, right? And if you take a look at, there are a few different graphs and charts in here about midterm turnout. But one of the things you can see, if you look on page 427 in your textbook, it's showing you about voter turnout and age groups, but you can see that both age groups, like the really old and the really young, there's a dip when it's not a presidential year. The years that they have labeled are presidential years, and they decrease significantly when the president's not on the ballot. Right. So midterm elections, they get about 35 to 40% voter turnout and that's when it's really good. But you also get what are called off-year elections or odd-year elections. And what these are some states, okay, some states like Virginia, they don't want, like this year in 2020, they didn't have any of their state and local races on the line. Right? The only thing you were voting for this year in Virginia were president, your House representative, and a United States senator. Your state and local officials, not on the ballot. They're going to do those next year in 2021. That's an off year. They separate their federal elections from their state elections. And the reason they do that is we want you to, or they want you to focus just on those particular offices. They're like, hey, in the federal government, these are important and they deserve their moment in the spotlight. And the state officials are important too, and they deserve their moment in the spotlight. And we want you to be able to focus on making good voting choices. While that seems like a good idea, it can have a drawback though. There's literally something called voter fatigue, where people legitimately are tired of elections. And think of this, if you live in Virginia, you had midterm elections in 2018, 2019 there was nothing. You had the 2020 presidential elections, and in 2021 you'll have you'll have the state and local offices, and in 2022 you'll have another midterm. And my gosh, your people get tired not necessarily of voting, but the campaign season. You get tired of seeing the attack ads. You get tired of seeing political signs everywhere. You get tired of people coming and knocking on your door asking you to vote for them. Voter fatigue is a real thing. So it's a trade off. But some states do that. They have these off year elections. We'll pick up with that tomorrow and talk about who comes out to vote and why people don't come out to vote at all. Hope you guys are doing well.